while the handout's going around, I'm going to ask you to imagine yourself in the following scene. You're looking out a window and you notice that there's a cat stuck in a tree. You can see this kind of black cat-like shape in the branches of the tree. You can hear the cat meowing. In fact, you have some relevant background beliefs. You've seen this cat before. It's your neighbor's cat, Margot, and that cat typically gets stuck in trees. And we might say, based on both your sensory experience and your background beliefs in this case, you form the belief that there's a cat stuck in a tree, pretty obvious belief in the circumstances. And I'll put this down here so I stay put. And we might say that you know in these circumstances that there's a cat stuck in the tree. After all, you have pretty good sensory experience and background beliefs. Those constitute pretty strong evidence. And let's suppose it's true that there's a cat stuck in the tree outside your window. We would say, you know it. But now suppose that out of the blue, a skeptic comes along and casts doubt on whether you know that there really is a cat stuck in the tree. Perhaps the skeptic says, you are and always have been in an artificially designed computer simulation of a world. This is the simulation hypothesis that Chalmers considers. The skeptic goes on and says, maybe the simulation you're living in is what's called a pure simulation, right? It's a simulation only containing pure sims, where pure sims are simulated beings that are wholly inside the simulation, not like the biosims in the Matrix, like Neo in the Matrix, or the brain in the vat, that have a physical life outside of the simulation. Maybe the simulation, moreover, is global. That is to say that the whole of the universe you inhabit is simulated, not just your local region, the cat, the tree, the city that you live in, or the earth, but the whole universe from the Big Bang till the present moment, and from the earth to all the far reaches of outer space. Finally, the skeptic muses, maybe the simulation you're living in is evidentially perfect, in that your evidence is insufficient to distinguish it from the world that it simulates. If you're in an evidentially perfect simulation, then there's going to be no evidence available to you that would distinguish that simulated world from the world it simulates. There is no red pill, as in the Matrix. There are no glitches, right? There's no way that you could have evidence that would rule out the possibility that you're living in this simulation. And the skeptic goes on to say, well, if this hypothesis is true, then you can't know that it's not true because you can't rule it out evidentially. And moreover, if you can't rule this hypothesis out evidentially, then you can't know many of the things that you think you know about the external world, such as that you have hands, or that there's a cat stuck in the tree, and so forth. And his master argument goes as follows. He says, you can't know you're not in a simulation because you can't rule that out on the basis of your evidence, right? Because it's an evidentially perfect simulation, you can't rule it out that you're not living in one. And if you can't know that you're not in a simulation, you can't know anything about the external world, again, because you have no evidence to rule out this possibility. And the skeptic goes on to say, if you are living in a simulation, the external world does not exist, right? You have no hands, there's no cat in the tree in front of you. So if you don't know that you're not living in a simulation, then you can't know anything about the external world. As luck would have it, you have just finished reading Reality Plus. And so you are armed with a novel and very persuasive response to the skeptic. You point out that, as Chalmers has convinced you, if you were living in a simulation, the objects and properties that you interacted with that you would interact with in the simulation would be real, just as real as the objects and properties that you might assume to be interacting with in the external world. And because you would be interacting with real virtual properties and real virtual objects, your thoughts would be about those virtual objects and properties. And so your thoughts would be true. So even on the hypothesis that you're living in a simulation, your belief that there's a cat stuck in the tree in front of you, that you have hands, and so forth, all these beliefs would be true. And so the skeptic's master argument doesn't go through. Okay, my aim in this paper is going to be to respond to this argument on behalf of the skeptic. I'm playing, as it were, skeptic's advocate. So though I think that Chalmers' response to the skeptic is ingenious, novel, and indeed very persuasive, I think there's a kind of pushback that the skeptic can make. There's a kind of fairly persuasive response. And so I'm going to try to explore that response. Okay, so first I'm going to just say something a little bit more in a little more detail about Chalmers' response to the skeptic. Okay, so I take it that the key to his response is kind of twofold. One of the first premise of the skeptic's master argument, Chalmers accepts, and the second one, Chalmers rejects on the basis of this kind of motivation that the skeptic provides for it, namely that if you are living in a simulation, then the external world does not exist. So it's that part that Chalmers rejects. But I think it's instructive to first consider the reasons why he accepts the first premise of the skeptic's argument, namely that you can't know that you're not living in a simulation. And here's how the thought goes. I guess we can start with the supposition that you're not living in a simulation, you're living in the physical world. Then your belief that you're not living in a simulation is going to be true. But that's not enough for knowledge, right? In order to know something, your belief can't just be true. You should also be justified in believing it. You should have sufficient evidence that your belief is true. And moreover, it seems like if someone comes along and presents a kind of alternative hypothesis, right, in which what you believe is false, your evidence should be able to rule that out, right? So in some ordinary cases, this seems to be plausible. Suppose this is an example from Chalmers' book. Suppose you believe that you have a genuine iPhone, not a clever knockoff, but your only evidence takes the form of some testimony from a dodgy-looking salesman. Okay, you have some evidence, you have testimonial evidence that your iPhone is genuine, but that's not sufficient, right? Because your evidence is not sufficient to rule out the hypothesis that it really is a clever-looking knockoff. So the sort of spelling out some of the details of the assumption, it seems to be that the skeptic and Chalmers is relying on something like alternatives on your handout, which says that for all subjects S and propositions P, propositions are the contents of your beliefs. For all subjects S and propositions P, if S knows that P, so if you know that P, then you have evidence E sufficient to rule out every possibility in which it's not the case that P, right? So in the iPhone case, you need to be able to rule out the possibility that your iPhone is a knockoff. So alternatives implies that if you know that you're not living in a simulation, then you have evidence that's sufficient to rule out the possibility that you are living in a simulation. And the skeptic argues by what's called modus tollens that since you don't have evidence to rule out the possibility that you are living in a simulation, you don't know that you're not living in one. And I think Chalmers implicitly relies on this principle in defending the first premise of the argument. And the second premise can also be motivated along similar lines, right? But of course, Chalmers goes on to deny, ultimately goes on to reject the second premise on the grounds that if you are living in a simulation, many of your beliefs are true, right? Many of your beliefs about the external world are true. Okay, so there are two parts of Chalmers' argument for this claim, which basically reflects the fact that truth is a relation, and depending on the content of the belief, so the truth of your belief depends both on what it's about, its content, and the way the world is in relevant respects, right? So there's two parts of the claim that your beliefs are true in a simulation. So on the reality side, Chalmers defends a view he calls simulation realism, according to which the objects and properties in a simulation are just as real as the objects and properties in a physical world. And his argument for this claim, I think, maybe doesn't always rely on this assumption, but this assumption plays an important role in the argument that when you have an evidentially perfect simulation, right, one that's indistinguishable from the world it simulates, that simulation is also what I'm calling structurally perfect, right? That it mirrors reality down to the last detail. It's structurally isomorphic to the reality that it simulates. So if you're living in a physical world and you have a glass of water, such as this, that water is composed of molecules, which are in turn composed of atoms, etc. In a simulated reality, you're going to have exactly the same structure, right? It's going to be structurally isomorphic to the reality that it simulates. There's going to be the main difference between a kind of simulated world and the physical world that it simulates is really in the ultimate realizers of reality, right? In a physical world, the ultimate realizers of everything are physical objects and properties, and in the simulated world, they're digital objects or properties, maybe something like bits. Okay, so that's the reality side. On the content side, Chalmers argues that if you're living in a simulation, your beliefs and your concepts are going to be about virtual objects and properties, the things that you interact with in the simulation. And he subscribes to what I'm calling the virtual content thesis. So if you're living in a simulation, your external world concepts and beliefs are about the virtual objects and properties you encounter in the simulation. For example, Chalmers would say that if you're living in a simulation, your external world concepts, say hands, tree, cat, water, and so on, are about virtual hands, virtual trees, virtual cats, and virtual water. Those are the things you're interacting with. Now, Chalmers motivates the virtual content thesis. He pointed out to me that it comes kind of later in the book, but it seems to be part of the general one way, at least you can think of it as one way to motivate the virtual content thesis is by appeal to this view that the external environment plays an important role in determining the contents of your beliefs and concepts. So he appeals to the familiar twin Earth thought experiment due to Putnam, according to which there's a planet that's just like Earth, except that the clear, colorless, odorless liquid that's typically found in lakes and streams and flowing from taps and so on is composed of XYZ rather than H2O. Chalmers imagines that we compare Hypatia on Earth and twin Hypatia on twin Earth, investigating the properties of that clear, colorless, odorless liquid in their respective environments. And he goes along with philosophical tradition in coming to the intuition that whereas Hypatia's concept, water, picks out H2O, twin Hypatia's concept, water, picks out XYZ. Okay, so you have a little table on your handout which represents this. I'm using these little corner brackets, little pointy brackets to represent content. So the content of the term water for Hypatia is going to be H2O, and for twin Hypatia, it's XYZ. And so when Hypatia thinks water is wet, what she thinks the content of her thought is H2O is wet, whereas twin Hypatia thinks XYZ is wet. And then he just applies, you can just apply this kind of thinking to the contents of your thoughts in the physical world as compared to the simulation. So in the next table on your handout, you look at the concept cat. Well, if you're living in a physical world, that concept is going to pick out physical cats because those are the things you interact with in your environment. But if you're in a simulation, that concept is going to pick out virtual cats. The property of being stuck, right? It's going to be picking out physically stuck in the physical world. In the virtual world, it's going to pick out being virtually stuck, and so on. So your belief that you might express with the sentence, there's a cat stuck in a tree. If you're in a physical world, the content of that thought is going to be, there is a physical cat physically stuck in a physical tree. And in the simulation, the content is going to be, there's a virtual cat virtually stuck in a virtual tree. Okay, so we can see now how these two parts come together to give a response to the skeptic, right? Because if you're living in a simulation, your beliefs are about the virtual objects that you interact with in the simulation. And because those objects and the properties that they have are real, there's nothing to say. There's no reason to think that your beliefs about the external world are not true. In fact, they're true. And so the skeptic's motivation for the second premise of the argument disappears. Okay, so let me go on now to my defense of skepticism. Okay, so the first thing I think the skeptic might be inclined to point out is that even if it's granted that your beliefs about the external world would be true if you lived in a simulation, it's nevertheless the case that the contents that your beliefs actually have are false if they're evaluated at the world in which you live in a simulation. The skeptic could argue, if you don't know that you don't live in a simulation, then you don't know anything about the external world. So just to elaborate, consider again your belief that there's a cat stuck in the tree. The proposition you believe, assuming that you are living in a physical world, is that there's a physical cat physically stuck in a physical tree. And that proposition is false if it's evaluated at a world in which you're living in a simulation. And now if we go back and look at alternatives on the first page of the handout, what that says is that to know that P, you need to have evidence sufficient to rule out all the possibilities in which it's not the case that P, right? In which the proposition that you believe is false. And since you don't have evidence sufficient to rule that possibility out, the skeptic is going to say you don't know that there's a cat stuck in the tree. So what the skeptic puts pressure on here is the epistemic status of the beliefs you actually have, by pointing out that their contents would be false if you lived in a simulation. Such a skeptic is not going to be moved by the argument that your beliefs would be true if you lived in a simulation, because that skeptic is going to say, no, it's the beliefs that you actually have that I'm concerned about, not the beliefs that you would have if you lived in a simulation. And so that's the sort of basic move that the skeptic is going to make. I'm suggesting he's going to say that that the beliefs that you actually have, since they would be false if evaluated at the world in which you live in a simulation, you don't know. Even though it's true, say that there's a cat stuck in a tree, you don't know that proposition because you cannot rule a possibility out in which it would be false. Okay, so moving on to the next section, called narrow content on your handout. Okay, let me step back a little bit. So up to now, we've been supposing that beliefs have just one kind of content, which depends on the environment in the way illustrated by the twin earth thought experiment. However, Chalmers is very famous for defending what's called a two-dimensional semantics, according to which our beliefs are associated with two kinds of content. So in addition to the kind of content that we've so far been talking about, which depends on the environment in the way we've just described, that kind of content is called wide content in this framework. But he also claims that our beliefs are associated with what are called narrow contents. And these don't depend on the environment in quite the same way that the wide contents do. In this picture, narrow contents it's often said that they're shared between intrinsic duplicates. So Hypatia and twin Hypatia, their beliefs have this and concepts have the same narrow contents, right? Their water concepts have the same narrow contents, which can be glossed as this kind of descriptive condition, the clear, colorless, odorless liquid typically found in lakes and streams and flowing from taps and so on around here. So the idea is that the narrow content is something that's shared between intrinsic duplicates and doesn't depend on the environment in quite the same way. I'm writing the narrow content just with italics in the little corner, little pointy brackets. So you see on your handout under narrow content, it looks like appeal to narrow content might give you a response to the previous argument that I just gave, right? So consider the belief that you had expressed with the sentence, there's a cat stuck in a tree. That has the narrow content, there is a cat stuck in a tree. And so Chalmers might argue by appeal to the narrow content that, look, that content is going to come out true both at a physical world, both when evaluated as at a physical world and when evaluated at a simulated world, right? Because in both cases, there's going to be some descriptive condition that's satisfied. There's the descriptive condition doesn't discriminate between cats and virtual cats, right? And so there'll be different kinds of things satisfying them, that description in the two different worlds. And so our narrow contents are going to come out as true. So this looks like a promising strategy, but I'm going to argue that it ultimately doesn't work. So the first problem with it, I think, is results from this idea that our beliefs are associated with two contents, right, the narrow and the wide. And so even if it could be argued that the narrow content is true both in the physical and in the simulated worlds, it's still the case that there's that pesky little wide content that's also part of the content of the belief. So if you're going to say the beliefs are true in both cases, you need to be able to justify the claim that the wide contents are also true. The other point I want to make is slightly more involved, and that's that I think the narrow contents of our ordinary external world concepts do not pick out virtual objects in simulated worlds. So that's the rest of the argument. I've just been told I have 5 minutes for that.
15-minute question for you. You have tons of time.
Okay, I'll see how far I get. I'll try to be brief. So there are two kind of platforms of the two-dimensional view that I think conspire to at least cast some doubt on the virtual content thesis when we look at narrow contents. And the first is that the wide content is partly determined by the narrow content of a belief or a concept on this view. So, for example, the concept water picks out H2O in our world in virtue of the fact that it's H2O that satisfies the description, right? It's H2O that is the clear, colorless, odorless liquid typically found in lakes and streams around here and so forth. And the second important platform is slightly more involved, and this is that the narrow contents of our concepts and beliefs are determined by what we would judge their concepts to be across all logically possible conceivable scenarios under suitably ideal conditions. That's kind of a mouthful, and I'm going to avoid the sort of technical presentation of this part of the view. So instead, So think of the narrow content, we're thinking about it as what's shared between intrinsic duplicates, and it's going to be determined by what we judge the content to be in all these scenarios. This, like, think of all the possible scenarios. If we think about just the water case, there's the H2O scenario, there's the XYZ scenario, there's some like ABC scenario, there's all sorts of scenarios. And so here's the recipe for how to determine what the narrow content of your concept water is. Well, first of all, make an inventory of all of these scenarios. There's the ordinary Earth scenario, the twin Earth scenario, and so forth, right? Now, take one scenario and imagine that the scenario describes the actual world. You actually also have to think about an agent in the scenario. But you imagine that the scenario is describing the actual world, and you then work out what water picks out at that scenario. The important thing that I want to note is that your description of the scenario may contain information that's not available to the agents at that scenario. So for example, when we describe the twin Earth thought experiment, Hypatia, who's the agent in that scenario, doesn't have access to the information about the microstructure of the clear, colorless, odorless liquid in her environment. We know that when we describe the scenario, we describe it as containing XYZ. And so on the basis of that, we can say what the term water picks out in that scenario. Okay, and then the recipe then is to move on to the next scenario until you've done all the scenarios, and the narrow content is going to be what's the same across all of these scenarios. In the water case, it's going to be something like clear, colorless, odorless liquid, etc. Okay, so the first argument I want to make with regard to the narrow contents, where I think the narrow contents don't pick out virtual objects or properties in simulated worlds, has to do with what I'm calling quasi-perfect simulations. So quasi-perfect simulation is one that's evidentially perfect but not structurally perfect. Such a simulation is going to be evidentially indistinguishable from the world that it simulates, but is not structurally isomorphic to one. So here's an example of a quasi-perfect scenario, right? Imagine that you're in this scene that we started with. You see the cat. You have this visual experience as of a cat stuck in a tree. You have all your beliefs and so forth, as in that case. However, as it in fact happens to be, right, this visual experience of the cat's smile, like the Cheshire Cat, is caused by computational processes taking place on a server outside San Francisco, while your visual experiences of the rest of the cat are caused by computational processes taking place on a server outside Reykjavik, and your auditory experiences of the sound of the cat meowing are caused by computational processes taking place outside Tokyo, right? So the causes, this kind of relates to Karim's question, right? The causes, however, I'm imagining, of your sensory experiences, your visual and your auditory experiences, are not co-located. And my thought is that if we're going to consider this scenario, we can't find a virtual object that will satisfy the description of cat, right? Ordinary physical cat, because we tend to think that a cat is an organism that both causes the visual and the auditory experiences that we have of it. Okay, so and there's sort of other ways in which the kind of structural features of the simulation could come apart from the evidential features of it. And I think this places at least some limitations to begin with on the scope of Chalmers' response to skepticism. So the narrow contents of our ordinary external world concepts and beliefs, I think, don't pick out virtual objects if the deviation from the evidence and the structure is sufficiently great. And one could think, for example, about some familiar skeptical scenarios as having this kind of form. So, for example, the Cartesian skeptical scenario in which there's an evil demon, we might think of as having this form, right? There's no reason to think that the mind of the evil demon is somehow structurally isomorphic to the world that the evil demon induces us to believe exists. Okay. I don't have much time. Yeah. Okay. I think I can be done fairly soon. Okay, so the final case I'm imagining actually involves perfect simulations, like not quasi-perfect ones, but those that are both evidentially and structurally perfect. In fact, this is generally what the simulation scenarios look like. So, so consider what I'm calling nested scenario. Imagine that Maya lives in a physical cosmos that's just like the cosmos that we live in, and she decides to create a pure, global, and perfect simulation of this world, which she runs in an iPhone on her in her pocket. But since she's like playing God with this simulation, she speeds up time. So at a certain point in time, there's Sim Maya in physical Maya's pocket. Okay, so the question is, what do the narrow contents of our ordinary external world concepts pick out in this nested scenario? Now, if we start just thinking about Maya's physical cosmos, it's pretty straightforward, right? There's the cat, the concept cat picks out the physical cat, the concept tree picks out the physical tree, etc. But now we turn to consider Sim Maya's environment, the objects and properties in Sim Maya's environment. And Chalmers' hypothesis is that our ordinary concepts, cat and tree and so forth, are going to pick out those virtual objects, the virtual cats and the virtual trees and so forth in Sim Maya's environment. But I think that this can be questioned. At least I think that given that we have this other raft of concepts, virtual cat, virtual tree, virtually stuck, and so on, right? It's at least rationally permissible for us when we consider that scenario to reserve the concepts cat, tree, and so on for the objects and properties in Maya's environment, and use virtual cat, virtual tree, etc., for the objects and properties in Sim Maya's environment. So that's my alternative hypothesis, and I think there's a few things one might say in response to it. One is that, well, maybe virtual cat works like black cat. So even though we have the concept black cat and the concept cat, they both pick out cats, and so you might think of virtual cat as a concept like that, even though it picks out the virtual cats in the simulated environment. It also, the term cat or the concept cat also does pick out those. And in response to that kind of thought, I want to say that it doesn't seem to me like we think of virtual cats as kinds of cats in the same way that we think of black cats as kinds of cats. In fact, you might think that we think a virtual cat is not a cat. And so it doesn't seem to me like that's the appropriate way to understand the narrow concept of the narrow content of those concepts. The second objection might be that this somehow like goes against or begs the question against simulation realism. But I don't really think it does, because the thing that simulation realism commits to is that the virtual objects and properties one encounters in a simulation are real. They have just as much right to be thought of as real. It's not that they are identical to the physical objects and properties that exist outside the simulation. A third response might be that, I'm being kind of chauvinistic and not really thinking about Sim Maya's concept. But I think if we asked Sim Maya, if we presented her with the nested scenario, with the full kind of idealized description of that scenario, she too would say that her concept cat picks out the physical cats outside the scenario, and her concept virtual cat picks out the virtual cats inside the simulation. Okay, so generally speaking, I think this worry about what our narrow contents pick out places quite severe limitations on the scope of the response to the skeptic. So it implies that if Sim Maya believes, or if you're living in a simulation and you believe there's a cat, or believe the thought that you would express with the sentence, there's a cat stuck in a tree, then both the narrow content and the wide content of your belief is going to be false. And this, of course, places severe limitations on the scope of the response to the skeptic. The response might still work in certain cases, right? It might work in scenarios in which the whole universe, the whole cosmos is constituted by bits, right? So there's no world outside the simulation. There's only this kind of simulated reality, only a digital world. In those kinds of cases, we might be inclined to say that our external world concepts have narrow contents that pick out, digital objects in those worlds. But it seems to me that whenever you have this kind of contrast with the world outside the simulation and the world inside the simulation, that it seems that we have the scope to make these conceptual distinctions between those two kinds of objects at the level of narrow content. And that suggests that, at least in those kinds of cases, which strike me as the most sort of common form of skeptical hypothesis, in those kinds of cases, there are limitations to how far the response will go. Thank you very much.